And finally, what I want to do is to either export it or queue it. So let's just queue it up. It'll open up the Adobe Media Encoder. Here we go. Throws into the Media Encoder and I'm ready to encode. Now, so the Adobe Media Encoder itself can be run as a standalone program, or it can be part of Premiere, just like it's used to be. And you can drag clips in here if I want to. I'll just drag a couple of other clips in here. Choose some settings. Any of those settings that I had there, the DCP, the Dolby Digital on the surround sound, they're all in there, exactly the same as it was in Premiere. And I can use that to convert a whole bunch of tiles of footage. There's obviously more presets in here because of all the more formats. There's several nice things they've actually added into the Media Encoder though. So let me just clear up my list a bit. If I go to a particular clip, I can right click on it and go to interpret footage, and I can change stuff, like I can change the basic frame rate and that sort of thing, which again is very useful. What I use this for a lot is image sequences. So I'm going to just click on my little plus, go off and find a bunch of stills that were for an animation that I knocked up in a 3D program. It's been rendered out as a bitmap sequence. I need to turn it into a video clip. So I'm going to open it up and in it comes to Media Encoder. Obviously you can just click on the format here, quickly zip through the whole thing, see what it's like. Obviously my clips come in here. I can choose the format that I want to make, whatever. Thing is, what frame rate's it going to make it up as? If I took it into Premiere and whacked it on a timeline, I'd know that it's going to be 25 frames a second or not. Well, inside of Media Encoder, there is a preference. If I could edit and then preferences, so you've got an awful lot of different settings here, but the one I want to go for is media, and this one, indeterminate media time base. It's set on 2997, American standard. So because that's set on 2997, this is now playing at 29 frames a second. I'm in the UK. I rendered this out with the idea of being 25 frames a second. So I need to change that. The way to do it is to use interpret footage, which is exactly the same thing that you would use inside of Premiere. And that's now in Media Encoder. Right click on the clip, choose interpret footage, and you can change all this stuff. So in my case, I just need to say, no, it's not 29 frames a second. Assume a frame rate of 25 frames a second. You can change things like the pixel aspect ratio. A lot of the times you'll bring clips in and it'll get that wrong. So you can change that. You can change the field order in case you've brought some clips in and it thinks they're upper field instead of lower field. If I'm coming from Premiere, it's not a problem because I'll have set all that in Premiere. So when I drop clips in here to get it encode stuff, it's nice that you can change it. But now that's 25 frames a second. If I come back to preferences and then media and choose 25, it won't change that clip, but if I bring in another one and have a look at that, that one's coming at 25 frames a second. So if I'm doing everything at 25 frames a second, I can just come into the preferences and change the thing which is indeterminate media time base. Basically means what frame rate do you assume things are if I don't know what they are, which it doesn't with the still image sequence. If I set that to 25, anytime I bring things in the future, it'll still be 25. But if it gets it wrong, interpret footage will let you sort it out. And then of course you can just choose to make it into whatever format you want to make. The other major thing they've added in is this, Mercury Playback Engine support. So you'll know if you're in Premiere and you go to the project settings, you have this thing for the Mercury Playback Engine. If it's on, then you're using the graphics card to do all your effects work, which includes scaling and stuff like that. If you use the graphics card to do the scaling, then you get the best quality scaling all the time. If you switch this to software only, so it's not using the graphics card, then to get better quality scaling, you've got to go to the sequence settings and tick that. Again, it used to be if you went off to export media, if you exported it directly out of Premiere, it would use the Mercury Playback Engine to do all the effects work. If you said queue it and it went to Media Encoder, it wouldn't, because Media Encoder didn't have Mercury Playback Engine support. So actually it would do it all in software. That actually meant that you could get faster encodes out of Premiere than you would out of Media Encoder, because Premiere will be using hardware to do the effects work and Media Encoder wouldn't. But now Media Encoder will use the CUDA hardware if possible. This is one area where having two graphics cards in a system also makes a difference, because if you've got one graphics card and Premiere is using the GPU engine, then Media Encoder can't. If you have two graphics cards, it can. I'm often asked, does having two graphics cards make a huge difference in Premiere To be honest, not a lot. It's hugely different if you're using a program like DaVinci Resolve, but in Premiere, 2 graphics cards doesn't have a huge effect unless you're doing stuff like this. Of course, whilst I'm here, I should just mention a couple of things which aren't different, which I would recommend that you always set. First of all, come up to Edit and then Preferences, and then go to Media and tick this box. Save media cache files next to originals when possible. Otherwise, it goes on the C drive and fills your C drive up. It's kind of annoying that I've ticked that in Premiere and it's not ticked in Media Encoder, but I've still got to remember to tick it in Media Encoder, because Premiere does make all this stuff up in the background, all these conform files and everything else. There's no way of stopping it from doing that. It does it to get better performance, but it defaults to the C drive, which means sooner or later it'll fill your C drive up. So I always like to tick that one. The other ones I actually like to tick is I like to come into the general settings and then say start queue automatically. Quite like that one, because it means when something pops into the queue, it'll start going automatically in the background. That's just a preference that I really like. I thought it was worth pointing out. I like to show the elapsed time as well. And there are some times when I like to specify the output file destination. So I like to tick that if I'm doing a lot of files, I want them to go somewhere in particular. If I tick that one and choose somewhere on the computer, then no matter what clips I drag in from wherever I drag them, let's go back and get some more clips and throw them in there. The output is set to that folder, which means all I have to do is change the input. Most of those have been in the Media Encoder for quite some time, so they're not exactly new, but they are things that I like to set, just because I find it makes my life easier. Let's dump all those in there. Again, they're all coming from different folders, they're all ending up in the same place. The main things are, of course, you've got all these different things on the effects side as well, and more formats. It also installs on its own now, so if you wanted to, you could stick the Media Encoder on a machine on its own, but of course you're going to need an Adobe license to do that, but you can actually have this just as a program on its own without having to put Premiere in there. In the old days of CS6, Media Encoder always went on with Premiere. Now you can stick it as a standalone little encoding program. It's a very good encoding program. Does lots of nice things.